Is there actually a God? Or have billions of people spent their entire lives organizing everything around something that was never there? That's not a rhetorical question. It's the most consequential question anyone can ask, because the answer changes what your existence actually means, whether morality is real or invented, and what happens the moment you stop existing. Most people never actually examine it directly. They inherit a position, belief or disbelief from where they were born, and rarely stress test it against the strongest version of the other side. This is that stress test. Here's the honest complication before we even start. Neither side of this question gets to claim certainty in the way we usually mean that word. You can't run a controlled experiment on the origin of the universe. You can't put God or the absence of God in a lab. But that standard, total, mathematical certainty, isn't actually the standard we use for almost anything else we confidently believe. You don't have that kind of certainty that other minds besides your own actually exist, or that the external world is real and not an elaborate illusion, or that history happened the way records say it did. You believe those things because the evidence and reasoning point strongly enough in one direction that doubting them would be unreasonable, not because you've achieved logical proof with zero possible alternative. That's the actual standard this question should be judged by too. Not, can this be proven with total certainty, but which position does the total weight of evidence and reasoning actually support? That reframing matters, because it exposes a common move on both sides. Some believers treat the question as pure faith, entirely beyond reason, which actually concedes more ground than necessary, since there's a substantial rational case to make. And some atheists treat disbelief as the neutral, assumption-free default position, as if theism carries the entire burden of proof and atheism carries none. Which isn't quite right either, since there is no God, is itself a positive claim about reality that needs its own support, not a resting state everyone starts from automatically. Before getting into the actual arguments, it's worth naming a few assumptions that quietly shape how people approach this question, because they distort the discussion before it even starts. The first is the idea that religious belief is simply what happens before science explains things, that God has historically been a placeholder for ignorance, and every scientific advance shrinks the space he occupies, until eventually there's nothing left for him to explain. This is often called a God of the gaps pattern, and it's a fair criticism of certain historical arguments that really did rely on ignorance. But the strongest philosophical arguments for God's existence were never actually built that way. They don't point at some unexplained phenomenon and say, science can't explain this yet, so God did it. They point at the most basic features of reality. The fact that anything contingent exists at all. The fact that the universe had a beginning. The fact that its fundamental constants are calibrated with what looks like extraordinary precision. And ask what best explains those features, given everything we do understand, not despite it. Advances in physics haven't closed these arguments. In some cases, like the discovery that the universe actually had a beginning rather than existing eternally, they've strengthened them. The second common assumption is that this is purely a Western, Christian-flavored debate, disconnected from Islamic thought. It isn't. Muslim philosophers were developing rigorous versions of the cosmological argument centuries before it became a fixture of Western philosophy of religion. Figures like Al-Kindi and later Al-Ghazali refined what's now often called the Kalam cosmological argument, and the Quran itself makes several distinct argumentative moves for God's existence and oneness that are worth taking seriously on their own terms, not just as an Islamic footnote to a Western conversation. Start with the argument that's arguably the oldest and most structurally simple, the cosmological argument, in its Kalam form. It runs in 3 steps. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. The first premise is intuitive almost to the point of being unremarkable. Nothing in ordinary experience just pops into existence uncaused out of absolute nothing. The second premise used to be the contested one, but it's gotten dramatically stronger over the last century. For most of human history, including in ancient Greek philosophy, the dominant assumption was that the universe was eternal, with no beginning at all. Then through the 20th century, observational cosmology, Hubble's discovery of cosmic expansion, the detection of cosmic background radiation, the mathematics of general relativity itself, converged on a starting point, what's now called the Big Bang. The universe, as far as the best current physics can tell, is not eternal. It began. If both premises hold, the conclusion follows by simple logic. Whatever caused the universe to exist can't itself be part of the universe because it has to exist prior to and independent of space, time, matter, and energy, all of which came into existence at that starting point. That means the cause has to be, by necessity, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and extraordinarily powerful. Those aren't extra assumptions bolted on afterward. They're the logically required properties of whatever it takes to cause space, time, and matter to begin existing, given that the cause can't already be made of the very things it's causing. The most common objection here is immediate and fair. What caused God then? If everything needs a cause, doesn't God need one too? But look closely at the first premise again. It says whatever begins to exist has a cause. God, in classical theistic and Islamic philosophy, is not described as something that began to exist. He's described as a necessary being, something that exists by the necessity of its own nature, uncaused, without beginning, the way the universe itself was once mistakenly assumed to be. The argument isn't smuggling in a special exception for God. It's distinguishing between two fundamentally different categories. Things that begin and therefore need an external cause, and something that doesn't begin at all and therefore doesn't fall under that premise in the first place. Asking what caused the uncaused cause isn't a devastating objection. It's actually a slight misunderstanding of what the term is describing. The second major pushback is more serious. Couldn't there be a multiverse, an endless sequence of universes generating each other, avoiding the need for a single beginning at all? It's a live position in physics, and honesty requires saying so rather than dismissing it. But most multiverse models that attempt to avoid a beginning run into their own version of the same problem. The mathematics describing an eternally inflating multiverse, developed by physicists including Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, still implies the whole system can't be past eternal. It still requires a beginning of its own. Pushing the starting line further back doesn't eliminate the need for a starting line. It just relocates it. A second, independent argument comes from something physicists themselves have been genuinely unsettled by: fine-tuning. The fundamental constants of physics, the strength of gravity, the strong nuclear force holding atomic nuclei together, the cosmological constant governing the universe's expansion rate, dozens of others, all sit within an extraordinarily narrow range that allows for stars, chemistry, and life to exist at all. Shift several of these values by a tiny fraction, in either direction, and you get a universe with no stars, no chemistry, no possibility of anything resembling life anywhere, ever. Physicist and astronomer Sir Martin Rees has described several of these constants using the metaphor of a dial that could have been set to any of an enormous range of positions, and yet happens to be set, with remarkable precision, exactly where life becomes possible. There are three main explanations on the table for why this might be. 1. It's pure chance, and we happen to be the universe where the numbers came up right. 2. It's necessity. The constants somehow had to be this way, for reasons physics hasn't discovered yet. 3. It's design. Something intentionally set the parameters this way. Chance becomes a genuinely difficult explanation once you look at how narrow some of these ranges actually are. Several are described in the physics literature as needing to be accurate to within one part in extraordinarily large numbers. Precision that would be like hitting a specific target the width of a single atom from across the observable universe. Necessity remains a real possibility, but as it stands, there's no established physical law that says the constants had to take these particular values. That would itself need explaining, not just assumed. This is where the multiverse gets invoked again, and it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. If there are enough different universes with different constants, then a life-permitting universe becomes statistically likely somewhere in the collection, and we simply find ourselves in one of the universes where it worked, the same way you're not surprised to eventually roll a 6 if you roll a die enough times. It's a coherent response, but it comes with real costs. There's currently no direct observational evidence for any universe beyond this one. The multiverse, at this stage, is a theoretical proposal invoked specifically to explain away fine-tuning, not an independently confirmed piece of physics. Using an unconfirmed, unobservable, and in some formulations, unfalsifiable framework to avoid the design explanation is a legitimate move philosophically, but it isn't obviously a stronger one than the alternative it's trying to avoid. Design remains, for many philosophers of science, including some who aren't religious, a live and reasonable explanation, not a discredited one. A third argument moves away from physics entirely and into ethics. Most people, across almost every culture, act as though certain things are actually wrong. Not just disliked, not just against social convention, but wrong in a way that would remain true even if every human on Earth believed otherwise. Torturing a child for entertainment isn't wrong because a majority voted on it. It would still be wrong even if a majority somehow decided it wasn't. That sense of objective moral truth is one of the most stubborn, near-universal human intuitions there is. The argument asks a direct question. If the universe is ultimately just particles and physical processes, with no mind, purpose, or standard built into it, where would an objective moral law actually come from? Evolutionary explanations can account for why humans developed cooperative instincts and a felt sense of right and wrong. Those instincts helped early humans survive in groups, but there's a real gap between explaining why we feel something is wrong and explaining why it's actually, objectively wrong regardless of what anyone feels. A felt sense of moral obligation that evolved because it was useful for survival isn't automatically the same thing as a real, binding moral fact about the universe. If morality is only ever a survival strategy dressed up as a feeling, calling something objectively wrong stops meaning what people actually mean when they say it. This argument is more contested than the first two, and honesty requires saying that clearly, some philosophers argue objective morality can be grounded in something other than God, through reason alone, or through the nature of rational agency itself. Those are serious positions, not easily dismissed. But grounding objective moral obligation in a transcendent moral lawgiver remains one coherent, arguably simpler explanation for why some things are just wrong, rather than merely disliked. There's a distinctly Islamic contribution to this conversation worth including here: the concept of fitrah. The Quran and hadith describe every human being as born with an innate disposition toward recognizing a creator and toward basic moral truth. Not a fully formed theology, but a kind of built-in compass that external influence can distort or override. The Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said that every child is born upon this natural disposition, and it's their upbringing afterward that shapes them toward a different path. The Quran also describes something like a primordial affirmation, all of humanity, in some pre-earthly sense, acknowledging Allah as Lord. Whatever the precise metaphysics of that verse, the underlying claim lines up with what the moral and design arguments are pointing at from a different angle. That recognizing a creator, and recognizing certain moral truths, isn't something humans have to be talked into from nothing. It's closer to something people have to be talked out of. None of this is airtight, and pretending otherwise wouldn't be honest. The single strongest objection to all of it isn't really an argument against these specific proofs. It's the objection built into the reality of suffering. If a good, powerful God exists, why does the world contain so much of it? This channel has a full, dedicated exploration of that question elsewhere, so this won't repeat all of it here. But the short version matters even in this context. The existence of suffering is a real difficulty for theism, and it deserves to be treated as one, not waved away. The standard response, that this life functions as a genuine test, that moral evil requires real free will to be real, that natural hardship carries a purifying rather than purely punitive function, is a coherent answer, but it's not a knockdown one that erases the emotional and philosophical weight of the problem. It's the strongest card against everything laid out so far, and it should be treated that way rather than minimized. A second, quieter objection is what philosophers call divine hiddenness. If God wants to be known, why isn't his existence simply obvious to everyone, beyond reasonable doubt, the way the sun in the sky is obvious? Why leave room for genuine doubt at all? One response, consistent with the Islamic framework already discussed, is that overwhelming, undeniable evidence would collapse the very thing that makes belief meaningful in the first place: free, willing recognition rather than forced acknowledgement. A universe where God's existence was as undeniable as gravity would be, a universe without the possibility of genuine, freely chosen faith. Belief would become more like observation than trust. That doesn't fully dissolve the difficulty, but it reframes what hiddenness might actually be doing. Not absence, but enough distance to make the choice to seek real. Put these two objections next to the arguments already covered, and something becomes clear. This isn't a case where one side has all the good arguments and the other has none. Both sides carry real philosophical weight. The actual question isn't which position eliminates all difficulty, neither does, but which position better accounts for the total picture. A universe that began to exist, constants calibrated with startling precision, a near-universal human sense of objective moral truth, and of something beyond the material pressing on human consciousness, alongside the genuine, weighty presence of suffering, and the fact that belief isn't forced on anyone. None of these four arguments, the cosmological, the fine-tuning, the moral, and the Islamic concept of fitrah threading through all three, is individually meant to function as a slam-dunk total proof on its own. That's an important distinction to be honest about. What they actually form, together, is a cumulative case. Multiple independent lines of reasoning built on different areas of evidence that all converge on the same basic conclusion: that a transcendent, powerful, intentional cause behind reality is a more reasonable explanation of what we actually observe than the assumption that all of this arose from nothing, for no reason, calibrated by pure accident, in a universe that just happens to also produce beings convinced that some things are really, truly wrong. It's worth being precise about exactly what these arguments do and don't establish. On their own, they build a rational case for a powerful, intentional, transcendent creator, what philosophers often call mere theism. They don't, by themselves, establish that this creator is specifically the God described in the Quran, or that Prophet Muhammad was his final messenger, or any of the specific content of Islamic revelation. That's a separate, further conversation, resting on different kinds of evidence. The preservation and content of the Quran, the historical record of the Prophet Muhammad, the internal coherence of Islamic theology and law. What this argument does is clear away the more basic obstacle first. Establishing that belief in a creator at all is a rational, evidence-supported position, not a leap made purely on unexamined tradition. Everything that follows, including which specific revelation correctly describes that creator, builds on that foundation rather than replacing the need for it. So does God exist. No single argument here delivers mathematical proof, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. But mathematical proof was never actually the standard by which people reasonably form beliefs about anything that matters most. Not history, not other minds, not the reliability of your own memory. judged by the standard we actually use everywhere else. Which explanation best accounts for the total evidence? A universe that began tuned with improbable precision, populated by beings who can't stop believing some things are really wrong, and who carry what Islamic tradition calls fitrah, a built-in pull toward recognizing something greater than themselves, points toward a conclusion a lot of people arrived at long before modern science existed, and one that modern science, examined honestly, hasn't actually undone. The question was never really whether this can be settled with total certainty. It's whether you've ever actually let yourself sit with the full weight of the case, on either side, instead of only ever hearing the version aimed at winning an argument. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, and don't forget to subscribe, dear seeker.